Welcome to the Poisoning Podcast. I'm your host, Erin DeLullo. I ask that you rate, review, and share this episode with a friend. Now, please help me welcome Ben Westhoff, the author of Fentanyl, Inc.
Well, nice to meet you, Erin.
Nice to meet you, too. So for our listeners, will you walk them through the history of fentanyl, where it started?
Sure. Fentanyl was invented by a Belgian chemist named Paul Janssen in 1959, and it was conceived as a replacement for morphine, and was particularly beneficial in the operating theater and permitted procedures like open heart surgery. And it wasn't until many decades later that it jumped into the recreational realm.
It's still being used in hospitals today, correct?
Yeah, it's a very important drug for end-of-life patients, cancer patients, even like epidurals, colonoscopies. It's very common.
So the gentleman who started it or founded it, the chemist, it's owned by what company? Is it Johnson and Johnson now?
Yeah, Janssen Pharmaceuticals is owned by Johnson and Johnson. Yeah.
Okay. And I think what I found interesting is the difference between opioids and opiates. Would you tell us about that?
Opioids refers to something made in a lab. So both opioids and opiates impact the opioid receptors in the central nervous system. But opiates come from a natural plant, the poppy.
Hmm.
So something like heroin, for example, whereas opioids are made in a lab, something like fentanyl.
And the synthetic opioids, they're cheaper to make, faster. Is that correct?
Yeah, if you want to produce heroin, you need a field of opium poppies, and it's susceptible to the elements, law enforcement, and it takes a long time to grow poppies, and you need to water them and things like that. Whereas synthetic fentanyl can just be made in a lab. It doesn't take very long, and it's very easy to keep it hidden, and it's much more potent. Fentanyl is 50 times stronger than heroin.
So why do drug dealers use it?
It's so much cheaper, and it's more powerful, and it works as an adulterant. So you can put fentanyl into almost anything that's a white powder, and that's why we see it in cocaine, heroin, meth, prescription pills, all sorts of places.
I was just reading an Axios story yesterday that there is a shortage on Adderall with it being sort of back to school time. So do you think that it would end up in street Adderall? Have
It's
you heard about
possible,
that?
but I actually was just helping put together this documentary about these Mexican pharmacies that are selling fake
Mm.
Adderall. These are legitimate Mexican pharmacies catering
Wow.
to American tourists in tourist-friendly cities like Cabo and Cancun, and this company that made the documentary actually tested the Adderall, and they found that there was often meth in it. So it's another
Oh,
example of an adulterant.
so you don't know what you're getting when you get an illicit drug.
Yeah, and as I tell especially kids and parents that any pill or any powder bought on the black market can and will have fentanyl and other dangerous adulterants.
So do users want fentanyl?
Some do, especially longtime addicted users who just aren't getting high off heroin anymore. And fentanyl is so powerful, it can kind of take you to the next level. So on places like the streets of San Francisco, fentanyl is being sold as fentanyl, and people just smoke it off pieces of aluminum foil.
That's intense. I I found an one of the stories interesting in the book, and I should let you know. So I work with a nonprofit, Harbor Path, and we distribute naloxone, so Narcan kits and Narcan to people because we believe it should be at arm's length with this epidemic we're in. And the story about the gentleman who made the spray fentanyl, it just really blew my mind. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
The nasal spray. Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
In my book, Fentanyl Inc., I interviewed a dark web dealer who bought a bunch of really cheap fentanyl analogs from China off the internet, and he made his own nasal sprays he made it sound like it was a harm reduction effort, that he was helping addicted users save money from the big pharmaceutical companies, but basically he made this solution that you could just a nasal spray for fentanyl, and I think he was very misguided in doing this. He's not a anesthesiologist himself who's trained to measure dosages, and it would be extremely easy to mismeasure what could be a fatal dose.
Yeah, well, with all of these drugs, right? You don't know what will kill you. It's such a small amount.
And it's
So,
also dependent on your own tolerance too.
right.
Someone who's been using it for a long time, it would take a lot more, but someone who never used this stuff before, a very even smaller amount could be fatal.
So you mentioned he was getting the molecules from China?
Yeah, at the time, China actually would sell these different types of fentanyl legally to anyone. And it was very common for export. The government was even giving all these tax breaks and sort of grants and rebates for companies that were exporting different types of fentanyl. They've since banned these different analogs, but the precursors for fentanyl are still made almost exclusively in China. And a precursor is like the most important ingredients to make fentanyl, and they're often sold to the Mexican cartels, and the Mexican cartels finish the fentanyl and send it north across the border into the United States, and that's how almost all of the illicit fentanyl gets into the country.
And we hear a lot about the Mexican cartels in the news. Do you think if we shut the border or secured the border, it would make a difference? And how much?
Um, I don't think we could secure the border, and I also don't think we it would make a difference if we could. 50 pounds of heroin is the same as 1 pound of fentanyl, and we couldn't stop 50 pounds of heroin from getting into the country, right? So
Right.
there's so many ingenious methods to get drugs, and they're using drones and underground tunnels, and coming across the border in people's cars when they go to work. I've heard about the cartels like drilling holes in people's trunks so they can open them from the outside, and they put stashes of
Mm.
fentanyl and other drugs in someone's car, a Mexican national who's, say, working on the other side of the border. And so they drive the car across the border without even realizing they have drugs in there, and then they retrieve them. The cartels retrieve it on the other side. So I think, we're never going to be able to do it. And the example I always use is that we can't stop drugs from getting into a prison, right? And
Right.
that's a maximum security environment. So to think we could stop them from getting into a whole country is it's not going to happen.
I was just reading a New York Times piece where, since a lot of these precursors and just fentanyl directly is sent through the mail, we were only able to intercept 1% in 2019. So, I mean, I don't know that 1% is making a difference.
Yeah, I mean, my argument is that we spend tens of billions of dollars a year trying to stop drugs from getting into this country, and
Hmm.
we should use that money instead, or a big percentage of it, to help people who are already addicted. The vast majority of people who are dying from fentanyl and opioids are long-term addicted users, and the vast majority of those people are not receiving medication. And so we have great opioid treatment drugs available to help people who are addicted, but most people don't get it. And so I think we need to put more funding towards that and outreach. And, we have methadone, Suboxone, and naltrexone, which is best known as the Vivitrol shot. And if we could get even half, say, addicted users onto these medications, that the death toll would be much, much less every year. So I think we should focus on that.
No, I mean, treatment is so important in this epidemic. I read that it's the number one killer, fentanyl, for 18 to 40-year-olds.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. Yeah.
And I wonder how many of those, I haven't seen the statistics on how many of those are repeat users versus a young person going to a party and taking a pill that they didn't
Yeah,
know was
that's
it.
another big issue is that the drug landscape has just changed so dramatically since I was a kid. I don't know how old
Mhm.
you are, but when I was in college, I could probably take anything. I remember one time at a party, this guy just came up and handed me a pill. I didn't even know this guy. I like barely knew this guy. He was like, "Take this," and I was like, "All right," and I swallowed it, and I lived to tell the tale. But today, that same thing could happen, and it does. And these kids think that basically they're just taking a pill like something from their parents' medicine cabinet,
Yeah.
and since it's a pharmaceutical product, ostensibly it should be safe, but it's almost impossible to be able to tell the difference between these fake pills cut with fentanyl and the real thing.
I sat through a presentation by the DEA where they put up pills, and I couldn't tell. I mean, it's just, unless you're testing them, how do you know? You can't.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes there may be a little sort of
Mhm.
grainier, they're not packed as tightly, but you certainly wouldn't want to use the eye test for something like that.
No.
Uh,
So let's go through the three waves of the opioid epidemic because this podcast is about um, educating people on how it started and where we're at and just some solutions. So could you give us some background there?
Well, in the 90s, companies like Purdue Pharma started marketing pills like OxyContin, which are super potent medical opioids, and their sales team kind of dramatically exaggerated or outright fabricated the safety efficacy of these pills. And so, doctors were trained to look for what they were now calling the fifth vital sign, which was
Hmm.
pain tolerance. And so I don't know. I remember my doctor asking me if I went to the urgent care or something like, how would you rate your pain on a scale of 1 to 10? And I was like, well, I don't know. How do you measure that? 8. And if you responded, I believe like 8 or higher, then they were supposed to prescribe opioids. And the idea was that in a medical setting, that these pills would not be addictive, and it was based on this kind of one study that was not really uh, accurate for most people because it was based on people who weren't leaving the hospital, a very controlled environment. And anyway, doctors started way over prescribing it, and a lot of these, otherwise law-abiding people started turning to street heroin once their prescriptions ran out. And so that was the second wave of the epidemic was heroin. And then eventually, by the kind of early to mid 2010s, there really wasn't enough heroin on the streets to sustain this population. And so fentanyl came and filled the void. and that was the third wave of the opioid epidemic. And now a lot of people think we're in what might be called the fourth wave, and
Wow.
that is considered polydrug abuse. And so if you do toxicology reports on a lot of the drugs that are found on the streets, it's not just heroin cut with fentanyl anymore, or meth cut with fentanyl. It's like heroin and meth and cocaine and caffeine and benzodiazepines, like everything under the sun is in these drugs. And most addicted users are not just taking one thing, but they're taking a number of drugs. You've probably heard of xylazine,
Yeah, oh
which
yeah.
is really common. That's a veterinary tranquilizer. And that's often taken in combination with fentanyl, and people use that. They think it will help them beat the withdrawal symptoms, and they'll kind of knock themselves out and make it through withdrawal. But really, it increases the odds that someone is going to die, because they're both downers. A lot of these different pills are downers. These benzodiazepines like Xanax
Yeah.
and Valium. There's all sorts of people often combine those with opioids, and again, that's a downer. And it all just increases the possibility that your heart rate, that your breathing will stop.
I read a lot about this issue, and something you just said blew my mind, and I don't think I've ever heard it. We didn't have enough heroin in the country to supply the people who were wanting it. That's
Yeah,
just mind blowing.
yeah. I mean, that's how many new addicted users there were in the wake of the opioid pill crisis. There were literally millions of new addicted users. Like, if it's really shocking if you go back and look how many people used to die from drug deaths. I
Mhm.
mean, in the 1970s, at one point it was like 2,000 people a year died from drug overdoses. And this was when Richard Nixon was launching the war on drugs, and it was considered at a crisis level. And
Wow.
now it's like 50 times more people are dying. It's just crazy.
And sadly, addicts were created, they were people who became addicts that weren't asking to become addicts, not seeking it. It's just when you take that many opioid pills, your body responds that way.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the real tragedy of the situation, is that so many people kind of unwittingly became addicted, and it really only happened in the U.S. and Canada. Those are the only big countries that have had an opioid crisis, and that's because of the way drugs are advertised and prescribed here. A lot of places like Europe, you're not allowed to do such advertising outreach in the way that you are allowed here.
Mm. Yes, I think we've all seen those commercials. So let's go back to China. You were able to visit labs. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I pretended to be a drug dealer, and I made contact with some lab owners and some salespeople over Skype, and asked if I could visit their labs if I came to China, and then they said yes. And so I showed up. I went to a lab in Shanghai and a company selling fentanyl precursors in Wuhan, and I lay out all the details
Yeah.
of this, like, kind of undercover intrigue in my book Fentanyl Inc. But suffice it to say, a lot of their customers were, Americans like myself, and so they
Yeah.
they didn't really bat an eyelash. They spoke good English, and I had my recorder, so I secretly tucked away, and it was pretty hairy being in these labs, but I got to see how it all really goes down. And I was most shocked at in Wuhan at this giant fentanyl precursors company, because they had just hundreds of young salespeople who were sitting at laptop computers and um, selling these ingredients over, to customers. And a lot of them, there's some Americans, but they're mostly like in Mexico. They told me Mexico was their biggest customer base, and they were, clearly selling these products to the cartels. The employees themselves didn't even know about fentanyl, or they didn't even know what they were selling.
Wow.
In China, the media has a control over everything. The government controls the media, so they had never even heard of the fentanyl crisis. And so I got the tour of this whole facility and met the CEO, and then I published my book, and
Yeah.
not long afterwards the CEO was indicted by the U.S. Department of Justice, and a $5 million reward was offered for his capture, but he's still
Based
at
off your
large.
book, based off
Ye-
the work you did.
Well, yeah, I mean, I talked with people in the DEA, and they said that my reporting was really helpful. They did their own investigation into him.
Sure.
He, but unfortunately, he is still at large. He didn't break any laws in China. What he was selling
Mm,
was legal in China, and so China actually, castigated the United States for meddling in their country's affairs. And so the only way this guy will be arrested is if he's dumb enough to, fly to the U.S. when he's getting off the plane, or one of our allied countries. But yeah, it's been a major sort of geopolitical sticking point between the U.S. and China. And I, testified on Capitol Hill. I was part of the U.S. House investigation recently, and I saw firsthand that these companies are not only operating with impunity, but they get the government has really encouraged it. I don't think it's it's a plot to kill Americans, as some people think it is. I don't think there's really evidence of that, but I think it's that it's really about capitalism on a big scale, and these pharmaceutical companies are trying to make money, and the government officials benefit when these companies in their provinces are making money and employing people, and that's kind of driven this whole thing.
wow. So, what do you think? Do you think the U.S. can have any influence over China in this regard?
I think we have, China doesn't want to be seen as the drug pushers to the world, and they don't want to be bossed around by the US. So they've kind of tried to save face by um, extracting some concessions from us. So, for example, in 2019, they agreed to ban all these fentanyl analogs, derivatives of fentanyl. And, that was in the middle of Trump's trade war. And so we agreed to relax some of these trade provisions. And then more recently, Biden and Xi met outside San Francisco, and Chinese President Xi agreed to kind of crack down on these companies selling fentanyl precursors to the Mexican cartels. And in exchange, the U.S. agreed to lift sanctions on this type of technology that China is basically using to spy on the Uyghur population.
Oh,
So it's, I mean,
trade-offs.
it's yeah, it's not great either side, either way you look at it, but there has been some progress.
So it's been 5 years since your book came out.
Yeah.
What improvements have you seen in the last 5 years?
Well, I mean, the death toll is still like terribly, terribly high, and so that's unfortunate. But I think there's been a perception in the way that we view drug abuse and addiction. And, I think there's almost no movement anymore towards incarcerating users. I think
Mm,
that's kind of like a red and blue agreement issue, a rare bipartisan issue, that there's really been a focus towards, uh, helping stop the drugs from getting into the country, which again, I think is a waste of money. but also there's been a lot more money towards treatment and harm reduction practices, and I'm glad to see that there's kind of less shame. You see people more likely to come forward and share their stories, and especially parents. I'm contacted by parents almost every single day who've lost children, and they want to help. They want to stop this from happening to other parents. And so there's been some great I hear often about billboard campaigns to spread the awareness about fentanyl, and I go around the country giving talks, so
Okay.
speaking at conferences um, and events where to help spread awareness of fentanyl, and I show my slides, my pictures from my undercover investigations, and there's a change in the perception of how people view the issue, and so that's a great first step. But we still need to focus, I think, more on this addicted population because they're still so vulnerable.
So do you have Narcan in your house or naloxone?
I do have some Narcan, yeah.
Yeah. I still, well, I'm sitting in West Virginia right now. So that's where I live. I do think in some populations there might be still a stigma with Narcan or a misunderstanding. And our goal at Harbor Path is to put it in arm's length of anyone who needs it. So we have it. I did a video. We keep it on our fridge because you need to know where it is. Um, but one of the interesting studies that I just read is that 1 in every 7 college students don't even know how to administer it. And this is such a vulnerable population when it comes to fentanyl.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really important for college students and schools generally, high schools everywhere to
Yes.
have access to, libraries, anywhere where, the, like public gathering places, I think they should have it.
I was walking through the county fair last night here in Jefferson County. I was thinking, does anyone have Narcan here? She probably should. And these are the things that now go through my mind. Well, thank you for your time, Ben. I really appreciate it. Everyone, even though it's 5 years old, I have it. Fentanyl Inc. You can still order it and buy it. And thanks for coming on the Poisoning Podcast.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Erin. It was great talking to you.
I ask that you rate, review, and share this episode with a friend.